The Airbus A35. O shuddered so violently that champagne glasses crashed onto the polished floor of the business-class cabin. Oxygen masks didn't fall yet, but terrified gasps rippled through the passengers as the aircraft suddenly dropped thousands of feet before climbing again with an unsettling roar. Flight attendants gripped the seats, struggling to keep their balance. Then the captain's voice broke through the speakers, not calm, not reassuring, but trembling with unmistakable fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention immediately. Our first officer has collapsed. We have suffered a serious flight control malfunction. If there is a qualified fighter pilot on board, please identify yourself now." Silence swallowed the cabin. The wealthy executives who had spent the last 2 hours boasting about billion-dollar mergers stared at one another, frozen. No one moved. At the center of the cabin, Ethan Walker sat perfectly still, one arm wrapped protectively around his 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, whose tiny unicorn backpack rested against his worn jacket. Just minutes earlier, everyone had laughed at him. A glamorous CEO named Victoria Langford had mocked his faded clothes, rolled her eyes when Sophie accidentally dropped her crayons, and loudly questioned how people like him could even afford a business-class ticket. The passengers had smiled along, convinced he was nothing more than a struggling widowed father who didn't belong among them. Ethan never argued. He simply wiped the crayons from the floor, tucked a blanket around his sleeping daughter, and endured every insult without a single complaint. Now, as panic spread across the cabin and the captain repeated his desperate plea, Sophie slowly reached for her father's hand and whispered with complete confidence, "Daddy, you promised Mommy you'd always protect people." Ethan closed his eyes for one long breath, kissed her forehead, unbuckled his seatbelt, and finally stood up. Every mocking smile disappeared at once. But why would a quiet, single father carrying a pink unicorn backpack be the only man capable of saving more than 300 lives? Ethan Walker shifted the pink unicorn backpack higher onto his shoulder as he stepped into the business-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 217 from New York to London. The backpack looked absurd against his faded brown jacket, worn jeans, and scuffed leather boots. Yet he carried it with the same quiet care someone else might reserve for a priceless briefcase. Walking beside him was 6-year-old Sophie, her tiny hand wrapped tightly around 2 of his fingers, her sleepy blue eyes struggling to stay open after the long wait at the airport. "Daddy, are we really going to see Grandma today?" she whispered. Ethan smiled, brushing a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "We are. Grandma's been counting the days." Sophie grinned before hugging the stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. Several passengers looked up from their tablets and champagne glasses as the father and daughter entered the cabin. Their expressions changed almost instantly. The expensive silence of business class seemed to tighten. A middle-aged investment banker glanced from Ethan's boots to the unicorn backpack before exchanging an amused smile with the woman beside him. Another passenger frowned as though someone had brought muddy shoes into a luxury hotel. Ethan noticed every stare but pretended not to. Years had taught him that dignity often required silence. He located seats 3A and 3B beside the window and carefully helped Sophie climb into her seat before lifting the backpack into the overhead compartment. The zipper was slightly broken, so he made sure it wouldn't fall open. Inside were Sophie's coloring books, spare clothes, medicine, a worn teddy bear, and a photograph of her mother tucked inside a plastic sleeve. Nothing inside was expensive, yet every item mattered more to Ethan than anything money could replace. Across the aisle sat Victoria Langford. Even before anyone recognized her, she carried herself like someone accustomed to being recognized. She wore an elegant cream-colored suit, tailored to perfection, diamond earrings that caught the cabin lights, and a designer handbag worth more than Ethan earned in several months. At 37, she had become one of America's youngest technology CEOs, appearing regularly on magazine covers beside headlines celebrating billion-dollar acquisitions and ruthless negotiations. She glanced briefly toward Ethan before returning to her laptop, But when Sophie accidentally bumped the armrest while climbing into her seat, Victoria looked up again with visible irritation. Her gaze lingered on Ethan's clothes, then on the pink backpack, then back to his face. "Interesting," she muttered just loudly enough for the businessman beside her to hear. "I suppose business class really has become affordable for everyone." The man chuckled politely. Ethan acted as though he hadn't heard. He knelt beside Sophie instead, fastening her seatbelt twice to make sure it was secure. "Too tight?" he asked softly. Sophie shook her head. "Can Bunny have a seatbelt too?" Ethan smiled. "Bunny's a brave traveler. He'll be fine." Sophie giggled while he carefully placed the stuffed rabbit beside her. A flight attendant approached with a practiced smile that faded slightly when she looked at Ethan. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass one more time?" Ethan reached calmly into his jacket pocket and handed it over without asking why no one else had been stopped. The attendant examined it carefully before offering an awkward smile. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." Ethan nodded graciously. "Of course." As she walked away, the businessman across the aisle whispered loudly enough for several passengers to hear. Guess they wanted to make sure he didn't wander in from economy. Quiet laughter followed. Sophie looked toward her father, confused. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" Ethan gently squeezed her hand. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups forget to be kind." Sophie accepted the answer immediately because to her, her father had never lied. She leaned against his shoulder while he unfolded a small blanket from the backpack and tucked it around her legs. Victoria watched the scene over the top of her laptop. Something about Ethan irritated her beyond explanation. She had built her entire life on disciplined presentation and relentless ambition. To her, appearances reflected effort. Success looked successful. Failure looked careless. The man across from her looked tired, underdressed, and completely out of place among executives preparing for meetings worth millions. She noticed the stitching on his jacket had been repaired by hand. His watch was at least 15 years old. Even his carry-on suitcase bore scratches from years of use. "Some people really don't understand image," she said, closing her laptop. The investment banker smiled. "Maybe he won an upgrade." Victoria laughed softly. "Or maybe someone felt sorry for him." Ethan continued arranging Sophie's headphones, carefully checking the batteries before placing them over her ears. "Remember what Mommy always said?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "Kind hearts are louder than mean voices." Ethan smiled, though the mention of her mother sent a familiar ache through his chest. Emily had been gone for 2 years. Cancer had stolen her in less than 8 months, leaving Ethan to become both father and mother to the little girl now leaning against him. Every trip, every bedtime story, every school recital, every scraped knee had become his responsibility alone. There were nights when he barely slept because Sophie woke crying for her mother. There were mornings when he secretly cried in the shower before making pancakes with a smile. He had learned that grief never disappeared. It simply learned to walk beside love. Sophie pulled a folded piece of paper from her coloring book. "Daddy, I drew Mommy looking down from heaven." Ethan unfolded the drawing carefully. 3 stick figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun. One figure floated among the clouds with enormous angel wings. Another carried a pink backpack. Ethan swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "She'd love this." Sophie smiled proudly. "I think she's flying with us today." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "I think she is too." Across the aisle, Victoria noticed the exchange but quickly returned to reviewing financial reports. Sentimentality had never impressed her. She believed emotion clouded judgment. Success belonged to those who made difficult decisions without hesitation. Families were distractions. Attachments were liabilities. Her assistant had once joked that Victoria scheduled board meetings with more affection than birthdays. The aircraft doors closed, and the safety demonstration began. Ethan barely watched the screens. Instead, his eyes briefly scanned the cabin ceiling emergency exits, flight attendants' positions, and the subtle vibrations beneath the floor. His gaze rested on the wing outside for only a second before returning to Sophie. It happened so naturally that no one noticed, a habit buried so deeply that even Ethan no longer realized he was doing it. Victoria, however, noticed something else. While every nervous passenger glanced anxiously during the taxi, Ethan remained completely calm, almost unusually so. Not relaxed exactly, but observant. His eyes tracked tiny details before settling back on his daughter with reassuring warmth. Funny, she thought. For someone who looks like he's never flown before, he certainly isn't nervous. The engines gradually increased power as the enormous aircraft rolled toward the runway. Sophie reached for Ethan's hand. "Can you count with me?" she asked. "Like always." Ethan nodded. Always. Together they whispered the countdown they had shared on every flight since Emily's death. 3, 2, 1. As the engines thundered and the aircraft surged forward, Sophie squeezed his hand tightly. Ethan squeezed back without taking his eyes off her smile. Around them, wealthy executives returned to emails, investment reports, and merger presentations, barely noticing the quiet father whose entire world fit inside a little girl's hand. None of them, not the banker laughing behind his newspaper, not the suspicious flight attendant, and certainly not Victoria Langford with her billion-dollar empire, could possibly imagine that the humble widowed father carrying a pink unicorn backpack had once sat in a cockpit where mistakes were measured not in money, but in lives. The Airbus leveled smoothly above the Atlantic coastline, and the familiar chime signaling that passengers could unfasten their seatbelts echoed through the business-class cabin. Conversations resumed almost instantly. Laptops opened. Crystal glasses clinked softly as flight attendants served champagne and warm towels. The atmosphere quickly returned to one of quiet luxury, where billion-dollar deals, stock prices, and international investments seemed far more important than the clouds drifting beneath the wings. Ethan Walker remained focused on something infinitely smaller. He unzipped the pink unicorn backpack, pulled out a small lunch container, and smiled at Sophie. "Are you hungry?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Can I have the strawberry sandwich?" "Of course." He carefully removed the crust, just as Emily used to do before handing it to her. Sophie took a bite and smiled. "It tastes just like Mommy's." Ethan felt the familiar ache behind his ribs, but forced himself to smile back. "That's because Mommy taught Daddy well." Several nearby passengers glanced toward them. One woman in an expensive silk dress whispered to her companion while discreetly pointing at the bright pink backpack resting beside Ethan's feet. "I can't believe he brought that into business class." Her husband smirked. "Maybe it's a fashion statement." Quiet laughter followed. Ethan heard every word but pretended he hadn't. He poured apple juice into a child-sized cup without spilling a single drop, placed a napkin beneath it, and reminded Sophie to hold it with both hands. His patience seemed endless. His movements were calm, precise, almost disciplined. Victoria Langford watched from across the aisle while swirling champagne inside her crystal flute. The image irritated her more than she cared to admit. She wasn't bothered by the child. She was bothered by the man. Everything about him seemed ordinary, yet he carried himself with an unshakable composure that felt strangely out of place. People who struggled usually apologized for existing. Ethan never did. He occupied his seat quietly, confidently, without seeking anyone's approval. Victoria leaned toward the businessman beside her. "Tell me honestly," she whispered. "Would you spend thousands on a business-class ticket if you dressed like that?" The man laughed. "Probably not." Victoria smiled. "Exactly. Presentation matters. Their conversation wasn't quiet enough. Ethan heard it. So did Sophie. The little girl looked at her faded pink sweater before glancing up at her father. "Daddy, do my clothes look funny?" Ethan immediately knelt beside her seat. "Your clothes are perfect. But the lady keeps looking at us." Ethan gently brushed a crumb from her cheek. Sometimes people notice what is different before they notice what is beautiful. Sophie considered his answer for a moment. "Mommy said beautiful people are kind." Ethan smiled softly. "Your mommy was very wise." Victoria rolled her eyes before returning to her emails. To her, the conversation sounded rehearsed, almost theatrical. She assumed Ethan enjoyed playing the humble father in front of strangers. A flight attendant approached with drinks. "Champagne, Mr. Walker." Ethan shook his head politely. "Just orange juice for my daughter and coffee for me, please." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "No champagne." Ethan smiled. "Someone has to stay awake in case she needs me." The attendant nodded with genuine warmth this time. "That's understandable." Victoria couldn't resist. "Business class includes premium champagne. It would be a shame to waste it." Ethan looked at her for the first time since boarding. His expression remained calm, almost impossibly so. "Some things are more valuable than free champagne." The answer wasn't rude. It wasn't sarcastic. It was simply honest. Somehow that irritated Victoria even more. She disliked people who remained composed while being criticized. She preferred reactions, anger, embarrassment, defensiveness. Ethan offered none of them. Sophie suddenly reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn coloring book along with a small plastic box filled with crayons. "Daddy, can I draw Grandma's house? As long as you keep everything on the tray." She nodded seriously. For several peaceful minutes, the cabin fell quiet again. Sophie hummed softly while coloring flowers beneath a bright blue sky. Ethan watched her with unmistakable affection, occasionally sipping his coffee while reading a small paperback novel whose cover had long since faded. A passenger across the aisle glanced at the title. It wasn't a business book. It wasn't about finance or leadership. It was simply a children's astronomy book with colorful illustrations. Ethan wasn't reading it for himself. Every few pages he stopped and quietly showed Sophie pictures of planets, stars, and constellations. "That's Saturn," he whispered. "Those are rings made of ice and rock." Sophie gasped with genuine wonder. "Can we fly there someday?" Ethan chuckled. "Maybe not Daddy, but maybe you." Victoria overheard the exchange and shook her head. "Dreams are cheap," she muttered under her breath. At that exact moment, the aircraft encountered a light pocket of turbulence. The cabin jolted unexpectedly. Sophie's small crayon box slipped from the tray table, bounced once against the armrest, and exploded across the polished floor. Dozens of brightly colored crayons rolled in every direction. One stopped beneath Victoria's designer heels. Another brushed against the polished leather shoes of the investment banker. A blue crayon rolled beneath a flight attendant's cart. Sophie's eyes widened with horror. "Daddy, I'm sorry." Before Ethan could answer, Victoria sighed dramatically and lifted one foot as though something unpleasant had touched her. "Seriously?" As she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "First the backpack, now this." Several passengers turned to watch. Sophie immediately climbed halfway out of her seat. "I'll pick them up." Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll get them." He knelt in the aisle, calmly gathering crayons one by one. Victoria looked down at him with open contempt. People should teach their children how to behave before bringing them into premium cabins. Ethan picked up another crayon without looking up. "She's learning every day." Victoria crossed her arms. "Clearly not fast enough." The businessman beside her laughed quietly. "Kids belong in economy anyway." Sophie heard every word. Tears filled her eyes. "Daddy, I didn't mean to." Ethan immediately abandoned the remaining crayons and returned to her side. He wiped away a tear with his thumb. "Sweetheart, accidents happen. Good people help clean them up, that's all." A flight attendant hurried over. "A flight. Please, sir, let me help." Ethan smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Together they collected the scattered crayons. As Ethan reached beneath a nearby seat, his eyes instinctively paused for the briefest moment, listening not to the passengers, but to the aircraft itself. A faint vibration pulsed through the cabin floor, barely noticeable, different from the rhythmic hum of normal cruise flight. His head tilted almost imperceptibly. Then he continued picking up crayons as though nothing had happened. The flight attendant noticed the brief pause. "Everything all right, sir?" Ethan smiled politely. "Yes, thank you." He didn't explain why he had listened so carefully. He wasn't even certain it meant anything. Old habits rarely disappeared. Back in his seat, Sophie sniffled quietly. Ethan placed every crayon back inside the plastic box, checking each one before handing it to her. None had broken. "See," he said gently, "they're tougher than they look." Sophie managed a tiny smile. Sophie managed a, "like you." Ethan laughed softly. "Not even close." Across the aisle, Victoria watched the exchange with folded arms. Something about the man's patience felt unnatural. Most parents would have snapped after enduring so much public embarrassment. Ethan never even raised his voice. Instead, he comforted everyone except himself. A few minutes later, lunch service began. Elegant meals were placed before every passenger. Victoria received grilled sea bass with imported white wine. Ethan quietly requested the children's meal for Sophie first and didn't touch his own plate until she had finished eating. He carefully cut her chicken into tiny pieces before finally taking a bite of his own meal, now lukewarm. The elderly gentleman seated behind him leaned forward and smiled. "You're a good father." Ethan looked slightly embarrassed. "I'm just trying to keep a promise." "To your wife," Ethan nodded once. "Every day." The old man smiled with quiet understanding. Victoria overheard the conversation but remained silent. For the first time since boarding, a tiny crack appeared in her certainty. She still believed the man didn't belong in business class, but she could no longer dismiss him as simply careless or irresponsible. There was something different about him, something disciplined, something quietly resilient. Ethan finished his coffee and glanced absent-mindedly through the window toward the massive engine suspended beneath the wing. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as he watched the fan's subtle rotation and listened once more to the distant vibration traveling through the aircraft's structure. It lasted only a heartbeat before he returned his attention to Sophie helping her color another page, as if nothing at all had crossed his mind. No one in the cabin noticed that brief glance. No one except the flight attendant who had helped collect the crayons. She found herself wondering why an ordinary widowed father would instinctively study an aircraft engine with the calm, practiced eyes of someone who had spent years trusting his life to machines flying thousands of miles above the earth. And while the passengers continued discussing markets mergers and luxury vacations, the enormous aircraft quietly pressed farther into the endless Atlantic sky, carrying more than 300 souls toward a fate none of them could possibly imagine. Nearly 2 hours into the transatlantic flight, the cabin lights dimmed to simulate evening, and a peaceful silence settled over the rows of reclining seats. Most passengers had returned to spreadsheets, movies, or sleep. Sophie rested against Ethan's shoulder, her small fingers still wrapped around the stuffed rabbit, while the pink unicorn backpack lay beneath the seat in front of them. Ethan gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face before turning his attention toward the oval window. The sky outside had changed. Thick layers of dark clouds stretched across the horizon like an endless wall swallowing the afternoon sunlight. At almost the exact same moment, the aircraft encountered another patch of turbulence. This time it was different. Instead of one sudden jolt, the airplane vibrated in short, uneven pulses. Coffee rippled inside untouched cups. Overhead bins creaked softly. Most passengers barely reacted, assuming it was nothing more than rough air over the Atlantic. Ethan did not share that assumption. His eyes instinctively moved toward the left engine. He watched the subtle changes in vibration reflected through the wingtip. His head tilted slightly, listening instead of looking. He wasn't listening to conversations or flight attendants. He was listening to the rhythm of the aircraft itself. The low-frequency hum that had remained perfectly balanced since takeoff now carried an almost imperceptible, irregular beat. To anyone else, it was meaningless. To Ethan, it sounded wrong. He glanced toward the digital flight information displayed on the cabin screen near the galley. Cruising altitude 37,000 feet. Outside temperature minus 56 degrees Celsius. Ground speed remained stable, yet the aircraft seemed to make tiny corrections more frequently than before. His fingers unconsciously tapped against the armrest in a slow pattern, almost as though calculating timing between vibrations. Then he quietly stopped himself and looked back at Sophie, reminding himself that he was no longer the man who once spent his life reading aircraft through sound alone. Victoria Langford noticed him staring out the window again and couldn't resist another remark. "Planning to inspect the engine from here?" she asked with a faint smirk. Several nearby passengers looked over. Ethan turned politely. "Just watching the weather." Victoria laughed softly. "Most people simply watch the movie." Ethan smiled. "Clouds tell stories too." Victoria shook her head dismissively. "That's certainly poetic." She returned to her laptop, convinced the strange widowed father was trying too hard to appear thoughtful. Ethan said nothing else. He reached into the unicorn backpack, removed Sophie's small pink sweater, and gently covered her shoulders because the cabin had become slightly colder. While doing so, his gaze drifted upward once more toward the ceiling panels. Another vibration, shorter this time, followed by an almost inaudible metallic resonance that disappeared before anyone else could notice it. A flight attendant pushing a beverage cart paused beside Ethan. "Would you like another coffee, Mr. Walker?" Ethan smiled politely. "Thank you. May I ask a question?" "Of course." "Has the captain requested any changes in altitude recently?" The attendant looked surprised. "Not that I'm aware of." "Why?" Ethan immediately shook his head. "Probably nothing. Thank you." She continued down the aisle, slightly puzzled. Most passengers asked about Wi-Fi meals or customs forms. Almost no one casually asked about altitude changes. Victoria overheard the exchange and smiled sarcastically. "Let me guess, you fly a lot?" Ethan nodded once. "Enough. Business or vacation?" "Family." "What do you actually do around airplanes?" she asked, remembering his earlier answer. Ethan looked toward his sleeping daughter before replying. "I help keep them safe." Yet Victoria interpreted the sentence in the simplest possible way. "Maintenance. Something like that." She smiled knowingly. "I thought so." To her, the mystery had been solved. He was probably a mechanic. That explained why he kept staring at the engines. Nothing more. The investment banker beside her joined the conversation. "Must be nice. Honest work." Although the compliment sounded polite, the tone carried unmistakable condescension. Ethan simply nodded. "Every job matters." "Not equally," Victoria replied without looking up from her financial report. "Some people build companies, others fix things after they're broken." Ethan remained silent for several seconds before quietly answering, "Sometimes fixing one thing keeps everything else from falling apart." The sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Even Victoria hesitated before returning to her screen. She disliked the calm certainty in his voice. There was no bitterness, no insecurity, Only quiet confidence. Another shudder passed through the aircraft, stronger than before. This time, several passengers looked up. One of the flight attendants immediately smiled reassuringly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're passing through an area of moderate turbulence. Nothing to worry about. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Seatbelt signs illuminated with a familiar chime. Sophie stirred awake and rubbed her eyes. "Daddy? I'm right here. Are we okay?" Ethan buckled her seatbelt again, checking it twice before gently squeezing her hand. "We're perfectly okay." Sophie trusted him completely. She closed her eyes again within seconds. Ethan, however, did not relax. He counted silently as another vibration passed beneath the floor. 3 seconds, then another, 5 seconds, then one more. Irregular intervals. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Something wasn't matching the normal rhythm of cruise flight. He glanced toward the nearest wing again and noticed a slight adjustment of the ailerons, followed almost immediately by another automatic correction. Tiny movements. Normal individually, unusual together. Across the cabin, a businessman complained that his internet connection had slowed. Another passenger argued about the temperature of her meal. No one paid attention to the aircraft itself. Only Ethan seemed to notice that the airplane felt subtly different now, almost as though it were working harder than before to remain perfectly stable. Victoria caught him watching the wing once again and sighed dramatically. "If staring at engines made airplanes safer, we'd all be pilots." Ethan almost smiled at the irony of the remark, but simply answered, "Maybe." She misunderstood his expression as embarrassment. "Don't worry," she added. "I'm sure the professionals up front know what they are doing." Ethan looked forward toward the cockpit door for a brief moment. "I hope so," he said quietly. His answer was so soft that Victoria barely heard it. Yet something about those 3 words sent an unexpected chill through her. It wasn't fear. It was the strange impression that Ethan hadn't spoken like a passenger placing blind trust in a flight crew. He had spoken like someone evaluating fellow professionals from experience. Before Victoria could question the thought, another sharper jolt shook the aircraft. This time, even the champagne glasses rattled noticeably, and somewhere beneath the steady roar of the engines, Ethan heard a sound he hadn't heard in years, a brief mechanical hesitation that lasted less than a heartbeat, but instantly erased the calm expression from his face. It was the first time since boarding that genuine concern appeared in his eyes. The metallic hesitation came again this time, followed by a violent lurch that sent drinks flying across the business-class cabin. Crystal glasses shattered against the aisle as terrified passengers grabbed their armrests. The Airbus rolled sharply to the left before the autopilot corrected, but the correction felt slower than it should have. Overhead bins rattled violently, and several oxygen masks trembled inside their compartments without deploying. Sophie's eyes flew open. "Daddy!" she cried, clutching Ethan's arm. He immediately wrapped one arm around her while fastening his own seatbelt tighter with the other. His eyes never left the wing outside. The engine continued spinning normally, yet the control surfaces were making unusually aggressive adjustments. Something was fighting the aircraft. Flight attendants hurried through the cabin, urging everyone to remain seated. But before they could reassure the passengers, another alarm sounded somewhere beyond the cockpit door. It wasn't audible to most people, only a faint electronic tone carried through the structure of the aircraft, but Ethan recognized it instantly. His expression changed. Across the aisle, Victoria Langford's confidence disappeared for the first time. "What's happening?" she demanded of a passing flight attendant. "Is this normal?" The attendant forced a smile that failed to hide her own fear. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence, ma'am." Before she could continue, the aircraft suddenly dropped again. Gasps filled the cabin. A laptop slid off a tray table. Someone screamed from farther back. Then the public address system crackled with static. The captain spoke, but his normally composed voice had been replaced by controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a serious flight control malfunction. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. His voice paused briefly before returning even more urgent than before. I have an unusual request. If there is anyone on board with advanced military, fast jet, or fighter pilot experience, please identify yourself immediately. I repeat, is there any fighter pilot on board? The entire cabin froze. Champagne flutes rested untouched. Business executives stared at one another in disbelief. No one moved. Victoria looked around with widening eyes, expecting someone in a uniform, someone distinguished, someone who looked like a hero. Instead, she saw frightened tourists, exhausted parents, and silent businessmen. The captain repeated the request. Any qualified fighter pilot on board, please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately. Sophie slowly turned toward Ethan. Her little face was pale, but her voice remained steady. Daddy, that's you. Ethan closed his eyes for a single heartbeat. For years he had buried that part of his life beneath ordinary routines, bedtime stories, school lunches, and maintenance hangars. He had promised himself he would never return to a cockpit after the mission that had taken his closest friend and left him carrying guilt heavier than any medal. Yet now more than 300 lives depended on someone answering that call. He kissed Sophie's forehead. Stay with the flight attendants. I'll come back. She nodded without hesitation. You always keep your promises. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Several passengers looked at him in confusion. Victoria actually laughed in disbelief. You, she said loudly. This isn't the time for jokes. Ethan ignored her. A nearby flight attendant hurried toward him. Sir, you need to remain seated. Tuck. Instead of arguing, Ethan reached slowly into his jacket pocket and removed a worn leather identification holder. Inside was an old military credential and faded flight wings. The attendant's eyes widened as she read the name. Major Ethan Walker, United States Air Force, Fighter Weapons School graduate. Status, honorably discharged. Her mouth fell open. Oh, my God. Ethan met her eyes calmly. Take me to the captain. Victoria stared at the identification in stunned silence. You're serious? Ethan simply nodded once. Within seconds, he disappeared through the cockpit door, leaving behind an entire cabin, struggling to understand how the quiet, widowed father carrying a pink unicorn backpack could possibly be the man the captain had been praying to find. Inside the cockpit, controlled chaos filled the cramped space. Warning lights flashed across multiple displays. The first officer lay unconscious against his harness while the captain struggled to manage radio communications, navigation, and flight controls alone. Sweat covered his forehead. The moment Ethan entered, the captain looked up. Major Walker. Ethan shook his head. Just Ethan. The captain barely had time to respond. The autopilot disconnected twice. We're getting intermittent flight control failures. The first officer collapsed from what appears to be a cardiac event. I can't manage everything by myself. Ethan took one quick look across the instrument panel. Years seemed to vanish from his face. His posture straightened instinctively. His eyes moved rapidly from the primary flight display to engine indications, hydraulic pressures, electrical systems, navigation screens, and warning messages. Every scan was smooth, disciplined, and astonishingly fast. Hydraulic system B is fluctuating, he said almost immediately. You're overcorrecting with rudder inputs. Trim's fighting you. Let me handle communications while you keep your hands light on the controls. The captain stared at him for half a second before realizing Ethan was right. You recognize that already? Ethan had already slipped into the right seat after medical personnel secured the unconscious first officer. Years of listening to airplanes, he answered quietly. Together they worked with almost wordless precision, Ethan contacted air traffic control, calmly relaying their emergency status while helping diagnose the cascading failures. He suggested isolating one malfunctioning flight control channel, reducing unnecessary electrical loads, and adjusting speed to lessen aerodynamic stress. Each decision brought the aircraft a little more stability. Outside, powerful crosswinds battered the Airbus as it descended toward the nearest suitable airport in Western Ireland. Every minute felt like an hour. In the cabin, passengers prayed, cried, or sat frozen in silence. Victoria remained motionless, unable to erase the image of Ethan patiently collecting Sophie's crayons only an hour earlier. The man she had dismissed as an underdressed mechanic was now sitting beside the captain, calmly guiding a crippled airliner through the worst crisis of its flight. Through the cockpit door's small window, one flight attendant caught a glimpse of Ethan's steady hands resting on the controls. There was no panic in his movements, only confidence earned through years of impossible decisions. The aircraft continued descending through heavy clouds, and for the first time since the emergency began, the captain allowed himself to believe that everyone on board might actually survive. The aircraft slammed onto the runway with a deafening roar as smoke exploded from the tires and streaks of fire flashed briefly behind the wings. Every passenger held their breath while the massive Airbus fought to stay on the center line before finally slowing to a complete stop. For several endless seconds, no one spoke. Then applause erupted throughout the cabin. Some people cried openly. Others hugged complete strangers. Flight attendants wiped tears from their faces as emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft with flashing blue lights reflecting across the rain-soaked runway. When the cockpit door finally opened, Ethan Walker stepped into the cabin looking exactly as he had before the emergency. His faded jacket slightly wrinkled, his old boots dusty, and the same calm expression on his face. The only difference was that every pair of eyes now looked at him with gratitude instead of judgment. Before anyone else could reach him, Sophie ran down the aisle and threw herself into his arms. Ethan knelt to catch her, holding her tightly as she whispered, "I knew you'd come back." He smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I promised you didn't, The cabin erupted into applause once again, this time for the quiet father who had never asked for recognition. As passengers slowly disembarked onto the mobile stairs, news of the emergency spread rapidly through airport personnel. Ground staff, paramedics, and airline officials waited outside, eager to shake Ethan's hand. The captain stood before the passengers and addressed them with unmistakable emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, every person on this aircraft is walking away today because Major Ethan Walker chose to answer my call. His experience, judgment, and courage gave us the chance we desperately needed. I owe him my crew, my aircraft, and my life." Ethan lowered his eyes, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. "We all did our jobs," he replied quietly. "The captain flew the airplane. I simply helped." While reporters gathered near the terminal entrance, Victoria Langford remained standing several steps behind, unable to move. Earlier that day, she had laughed at his clothes, questioned his right to sit in business class, and mocked the pink unicorn backpack that now rested once again on his shoulder. Yet during the emergency, she had learned the truth from the captain and airline officials. Ethan had once been one of the Air Force's most respected fighter pilots, decorated for extraordinary courage in combat. He had left the military not because he lacked ability, but because he carried the unbearable grief of losing a fellow pilot during a mission. After his wife Emily died of cancer, he had quietly chosen a life away from medals and headlines, dedicating every remaining part of himself to raising Sophie. The more Victoria learned, the smaller she felt. She slowly walked toward Ethan as the crowd began to disperse. For the first time in years, she found herself struggling to find the right words. "Mr. Walker," she said softly. Ethan turned with the same calm smile he had worn all day. Victoria looked down for a moment before meeting his eyes. "I'm ashamed of the way I treated you. I judged your worth by your clothes, your backpack, and your seat. I never bothered to see the man standing in front of me. I'm truly sorry." The apology was quiet, sincere, and completely different from the confident executive who had boarded the airplane only hours earlier. Ethan looked at Sophie, who was happily hugging her stuffed rabbit before looking back at Victoria. "We're all wrong about people sometimes," he said gently. "What matters is what we choose after we realize it." Victoria blinked away tears. "How can you forgive me so easily?" Ethan smiled as Sophie reached for his hand. "Because carrying resentment is heavier than carrying this backpack." He lifted the pink unicorn bag slightly, unicorn, making Sophie giggle. Victoria laughed through her tears. "The world will remember you as a hero." Ethan shook his head. "I appreciate that, but the title I'm most proud of isn't major." He looked down at Sophie with unmistakable love. "It's Dad." Sophie wrapped both arms around his leg and beamed up at him. "That's my favorite title, too." Together they walked toward the terminal, hand in hand, the little pink unicorn backpack resting on Ethan's shoulder exactly as it had when the journey began. This time, however, no one saw an old backpack or worn clothes. They saw quiet strength, unwavering love, and a man who had never needed applause to prove his worth. As father and daughter disappeared into the crowd to begin their long-awaited reunion with Sophie's grandmother, Victoria remained standing in silence, realizing that true greatness never announces itself. It reveals itself only when ordinary people are given an extraordinary moment to choose courage over fear, humility over pride, and love over everything else.